Please. So this is panel one, the entertainment panel. And at this point, I will ask Reece, our moderator, to come up and kick things off.
Good morning, everyone. I like that. Okay, I'll be very careful up here. Well, I want to welcome you to the entertainment panel. We're going to move from talking about preservation to interpretation and engagement. And in this panel, we're going to explore how we engage with audiences in the digital realm. What constitutes meaningful engagement? How can we be better at enabling it? And what areas offer the most opportunities for engagement? And more importantly, we're going to discuss the relationship between stories and engagement, and also explore what it means to create visitor-directed learning experiences. I'd like to take this opportunity to just introduce our panelists, and after I do that, each of them are going to talk for about 7 or 8 minutes about their work they're doing or any particular projects, and then we'll have a discussion and end with some Q&A with the audience. First, we have Greg Downing, founder of Hyperacuity, works both creatively and technically, specializing in image-based 3D technologies and computational photography techniques applied to virtual reality and augmented reality. His AR/VR work has focused on expressing cultural heritage and museum interpretations, while his environment work can be seen in the first Oscar-winning VR experience, Carne y Arena. You can see his Lightfield work in Google VR's Welcome to Lightfields, his cinematography in a number of VR films as well as IMAX, and his photographic work with full dome and VR installations that you can find in a number of museums all over the world. His CGI work has appeared in a number of Hollywood blockbusters, and his finding inspiration is at the intersection of art, science, technology, and culture. Our second panelist is Amy Hedrick. She is CEO and co-founder of Cleanbox Technology. As a thought leader providing insights into immersive technology, she brings solutions and innovation in smart tech hygiene. Most recently, Amy was manager of content and digital media for the think tank division of Li & Fung, a leading global consumer goods sourcing and manufacturing company based in Hong Kong. Her expertise includes conducting bespoke research and C-level reports within technology, retail, and cross-genre complications. Amy was also one of the 4 writers for the Fung Business Intelligence Center. She spent her early career working with international aid organizations, managing multiple teams of healthcare, construction, and emergency intervention professionals, and overseeing direct aid projects. Our third panelist is Latoya Peterson. She lives at the intersection of emerging technology and culture, and was named one of Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30 Rising Stars in Media. She is best known for the award-winning blog racialicious.com, which looks at the intersection of race and pop culture. She is co-founder and chief experience officer at Glow Up Games, a creative studio focusing on telling beautifully crafted stories using mobile, augmented reality, virtual reality, AI, and other emerging technologies. In 2018, she soft-launched AI in the Trap, a collaborative art project that explores the future of artificial intelligence and predictive policing through a hip-hop lens. Previously, she was the deputy editor, digital innovation for ESPN's The Undefeated, and editor-at-large at Fusion, and the senior digital producer for The Stream, a social media-driven news show on Al Jazeera America. In 2016, she produced a critically acclaimed YouTube series on girl gamers that was highlighted on Spotify. So we'll welcome our panelists today, and I'd like to invite Greg to come up to the podium to talk about his work.
Thank you. So I'd like to just go in and show some examples of projects that I've worked on where we've tried to explore some of what we can do in digital to increase engagement. So there's a lot of different ways that you could potentially engage, and I think that it's very wide open, especially when it comes to digital. So we'll just look at a few case examples. The name of my company is Hyperacuity, which confuses a lot of people, so I'll just tell you it's a medical term that means that you can, whatever sense you're describing, you have higher than normal sense, like better than 20/20 vision. And that's because what we're trying to do when we're scanning and sampling is we're trying to scan at an even better resolution, more high dynamic range than you could see if you were in the location, and then use creative tools to then explore that. Here's examples of some of the previous VR projects that I've worked on. So for the last 6 years, it's been mostly virtual reality projects. The examples I want to look at are ways that we can use new media, such as VR, to add context to what you're examining in a museum setting. So that kind of context can be a VR field trip to go anywhere in the world and jump from one spot in the world to another immediately. Shared experiences where distance is no barrier between you and other people in the world. And then traditional and magical tools that make the exploration experience more rich and hopefully memorable and interactive for the user. One of the projects I did the scanning on was for the Smithsonian American Art Museum Beyond the Walls piece. And in this, I'll just scrub through this a bit. So this is a capture from the VR headset that is demonstrating how we chose several pieces of the artwork, and we worked
Did
to
you
add
know
additional
that some of America's greatest
context
sculptures
to
are
that.
hidden in cemeteries?
So,
in 1885,
in addition to the
Marion
voiceover
Hooper Clover
that
Adams, an
describes
amateur photographer and the wife of the
specific
writer Henry Adams,
sculpture,
committed
when
suicide by
the
drinking
audio
poisonous
completes,
chemicals used to
it
develop
takes you to
Saint Gaudens,
an earlier cast of that same sculpture
Graveside Memorial.
that was originally placed in a cemetery. So it quickly takes you from the museum setting to where this artwork was first viewed. And later in the sequence, we'll have the next artwork. We've got
Have you
a
ever
painting of the
experienced
aurora.
Borealis? The sky
And
lights up like a glowing curtain
once we get the
overhead. That is as
explanation for
Edwin
the
Church
painting,
painted
it takes
the
us
church painting stood by silence for the
to
sea,
a real
and again
aurora
did.
and places us in Iceland, where we can freely view an actual aurora before us. So recreating that association and getting a richer interaction. Other ways that we proposed exploring, at the time there were certain frame rate issues with doing something like this, but this
Did
was
you
another
know
proposal
that some of
we
America's
had
greatest
was
sculptures
to,
are hidden in suicide by drinking?
looks
Buddhist
like
idea.
the slide repeated. Let's try the one more. Was to create a magic window between worlds. So this was a way that we could see both worlds simultaneously. So there's a frame you held up, and that would be a little window into the world where the piece is actually installed. So you could see both at the same time. And this window was also a portal. So if you actually took the window, and we could use this to compare the two models. So you can kind of slice through the two models and see where they're different. And there are some interesting differences that were found here. And we think that mainly this was differences in the way that the wax was packed into the mold for the two castings. But it's a very interesting way to explore that. Also, the frame itself, if you put it over your head, that transported you to the other place and became a window back and forth. So this is a kind of a fun mode of interaction and really gets you thinking about the relationship between the two statues. Another project I worked on was the No Spectators exhibit that was at the Renwick. And this was an exploration of how to connect people over distances to create richer interaction. I primarily worked on the scanning of the artwork, and it was assembled by Sansar. And in this particular piece, we took a slightly different approach in the scanning in that we didn't scan the actual museum. There's a CG version of the museum, and all the scanned artwork is placed within it. And then Nora, who curated the exhibit, was able to go into that VR world, and an avatar of her was represented in that VR world. And at certain events, let's see if I get the frame here. When there were VR conferences on the West Coast, there's also an exhibit that traveled to different schools where they would put kids in VR. She could join those people from the other side of the country, and she could give a guided tour, and they could ask questions and point to things and interact in a very normal human way. So this was a method for adding that social aspect and to make distance no barrier. For magical tools, first I'll start with a project where we used a very traditional tool, very old optical tool. So this is an experience of the eclipse, where it's a mixture of photogrammetry, spherical live action video, and the addition of a digital telescope. So to capture this piece, I shot spherically the environment of the eclipse, and also telephoto views that you could look through. When you look through the telescope, you'd see synchronized views of the eclipse. So I'm just going to skip forward a little bit here, so you could actually view the eclipses if you were. Now finally, my most recent project is a project, it's not yet complete, but this is a project created in the Mogao Caves in China. So this is a Silk Road site with, where there's over 500 of these caves that have very intricate and beautiful paintings all over the walls. And to do this, to capture this, we got gigapixel textures on all the surfaces, and they're streaming in. So we added a magnifier that you can use to explore the artwork. And here we're comparing the photo that was taken 100 years ago to the current state. So it actually fills in some of the data that's missing in the current real world. But this is something where we took about 4,000 photos of the interior to get the kind of resolution we needed to create this interaction that allowed you to explore more deeply. And I think that is it for my time. So thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for having me. I realize I've never heard my bio read back to me when I was sitting on stage before, and there's probably no element of entertainment mentioned there, but I do, I come from a content creation background and have been using that for a number of years into the various fields that I've worked. So Cleanbox is a premium hygienic solution, smart tech hygiene. I'm not going to talk about my company very much, but just to give you a little bit of background of why I'm up here and what we do. We work with immersive technology, so virtual, augmented, mixed reality, and we actually provide the hygiene component, which is really critical in terms of logistics and rollouts for any kind of commercial use case, so whether that be entertainment, healthcare, enterprise, and so on. But going back to why we're here and talking about engagement, I thought I would share some of the things, just a few simple points that I think are really important in terms of engagement, and hope that will, spark some questions later on with the audience. What constitutes meaningful engagement? I'm probably not sharing anything groundbreaking here, but I think these are really good reminders. When you're creating content and when you're talking and trying to take content that you have and engage on any level, whether that's entertainment, education, or any other use case, keep it simple, make it social, and think about the story that you're trying to tell. Simple. What problem are you solving? So when it comes to using any sort of immersive technology, you think in entertainment, are you actually solving a problem? What does entertainment do? Does entertainment actually solve a problem? It does, actually. There are a lot of problems that entertainment can solve, although you have to, if you think about it, one of the things that it does is it's a distraction. So if you are stressed or tired or you've been working too hard, entertainment can be very distracting. It can also create stimulate you creatively. You hear a story or you're engaged in something, you watch a show that you like, or you're reading a book or looking at a piece of art. Those are all various forms of entertainment that are engaging your mind in a different way. And it either can create empathy or have the opposite effect, and decompression, of course. So those are problems that entertainment is actually solving. So when you're thinking about telling a story in an entertaining way, I think it's important to keep in mind what entertainment can actually accomplish. Because just to create a better or a different experience isn't enough, which there are various ways that you can take and tell a story, and it could be the same story. You could be reading it or watching it as a movie or looking at it in a visual representation. Just doing something differently does not necessarily make it a better experience. You have to think about the problem that you're solving by the choice of technology that you're using. So simple, social. This is all, you can see all these pictures are virtual reality focused, although I think, and I think that's an important way to share a story. But one of the things that they all do well is there's a social component to it. So if you want something to be successful, repeatable, spread the word of mouth, grassroots, and even go up the chain in terms of being able to convince the people, the decision makers in your organization that this is a good path to take, the social component is very critical. So LBE is location-based entertainment. It's expected to grow at a 32.2% rate. That's the reason for that is it's a social experience. Now, I don't know how many people are familiar with location-based entertainment in terms of VR or AR, but basically, sometimes the bigger complaint about VR is you have a headset on. Are you really, really engaged with other people? You actually are, and it's pretty amazing to see. So I put the statistics up here simply to show that successfully using socialization and entertainment is effective. So I just included a quote from one of my favorite VR people. 250 million players are spending over $2 billion a year to dress up their avatars and make sure they have the right dance moves. Fortnite is not a game, it's a place where kids go hang out with their friends. I'll move forward. And finally, story. Sometimes combining the combination, that story, social, it's enough of a story. What is the story that you want to tell? And when I was here yesterday, there was one of the exhibits that had to do with, I forget which Native American tribe, it was a tribe from Alaska, and there was a headpiece that was, probably the people are here somewhere in the audience. Oh, there you go. Nice work there. And basically worked with the leader of that Native American tribe, what's the name of it? Thank you. So it was they replicated it, and they were able to share that artifact in a different way. Now, the interesting story that stuck with me is that they were able to take the new piece and it became a spiritual item. And that is an interesting thing to me, because just reading and glancing at the newspaper or just maybe looking at the artifact wouldn't let me know that. So how can you take Keep it simple, keep it social, share a story like that. Immersive technology, and I'll just wrap up with this, but you engage in a different way. It has a very, again, coming back to what entertainment solves, one of those things is distraction, again. If you're looking at even the way it's used in healthcare pain management, it's actually changing the way your brain is perceiving that pain. So just thinking about these three components in terms of entertainment, engagement, and what can keep it successful, that will be important. And thank you very much for your time.
All right, hello, good morning. Well, so I'm Latoya Peterson. I'm CXO of Glow Up Games, so we're a new studio. You see something really fun from us in spring of 2020, so you can look out for that. However, when I was asked if I wanted to participate in the Smithsonian Digitization Conference, I was like, you know, I have been having this problem, and this is kind of the perfect audience to help me solve it. So this is like part selfish, part artistic, and hopefully part provocative, that helps you guys get a better sense of what we're actually doing with collections for people like me who don't come from an art background, but I'm an artist and a entertainment practitioner. That's what I do. So I called this Please Mind the Archival Gap, and you'll see why in a minute. So I started my journey into playing with emerging technology around the time that, well, as long as I've been on the internet, but it really kind of got to a fine point when I worked at ESPN. ESPN is owned by Walt Disney Company, and Disney has a lot of employee programs that they use to develop people. So because I was doing experimental things with AR and VR at the network, the Disney group asked me to come into their kind of company-wide group, where we discussed all the things that you can do with AR and VR. And they eventually put me in an AI ML group, where I learned artificial intelligence and machine learning, and really started to try to dig into what I could do with that, except for one thing. I'm not actually the technical person in any of the things that I'm doing. A lot of times I function more as a producer. I help bring the money together, I help sell the vision, I do the concept, I talk to the executives, but I am not the person that normally implements. So when I left ESPN and Disney and decided I wanted to kind of figure out how do I go deeper into this like really provocative new thing, particularly not being particularly mathematic, not really being a coder. So I did all kinds of things. And one of the things that I did was join the Black and AI group, which is an international collection of African American professionals working in artificial intelligence. They convinced me to do a workshop at the Neural Information Processing Systems Conference in ERIPS. Which was my first ever academic anything. So I was like very intimidated, and that's where I presented AI in the Trap. But while I was at that conference, I went to a creativity and ML workshop. And there were all these fascinating projects, including one called Runway. And so Runway is visually, you can see that up here. It's made for artists and people who are used to things like Photoshop and Adobe Premiere, but it makes it possible to browse machine learning models and select them in the same way you would select a template. It's a game changer. And now it's actually an open beta, so anyone can try. I think it's runwayapp.ml, but you can now download it and try it for yourself. It's phenomenal from a visuals perspective. So for me, I was like, oh, I can just click if I want to play with motion capture, image synthesis, object recognition. I can do pose, I can do anything I want. Fantastic. So I started playing with the system. One of the things that I learned, I also went to NVIDIA's Women in AI training. And one of the things they teach you is a very simple procedure called a style transfer, right? So style GANs, which is what this database is. This is so automated and so simple. You've seen it everywhere at this point. You've seen it in the Prisma app. You've seen it with the Google Arts app, which I'll talk about later. But if you learn to try to make it from scratch, to do it yourself as kind of like an artificial intelligence training, it takes about 3 hours. So you can like kind of figure out how you can do a style transfer. So I was like, cool. Okay, so for one of my first projects, I want to do a style transfer. Let's figure out what we can do here. So the first one and the most famous one is adaptive style transfer, where you repaint images in the styles of famous painters. And like I said, we've seen this before. It's been circulating around pop culture since at least like 2016. So I went, great. All right, let me find something to play with. Found one of my favorite stock images of black ladies in tech. And I was like, okay, whose style can I use? And I went, okay, cool. Cezanne, Jackson Pollock, Monet, Picasso, Van Gogh. Something felt missing. And I went, are there any women here? Are there any African American artist styles that I can try? No, actually. And so what's interesting, the block that I hit, because the idea I had was to transfer rap covers, like iconic hip-hop album covers, into a different artist style using a style GAN, which would be super fun, except where am I going to pull the source material from? Turns out, when I tried to figure out how to solve this problem, none of my friends kind of had an answer. I emailed Paola Antonelli, who runs the MoMA R&D lab, and I was like, hey, Paola, like, do you know of anybody that has like a repository like this? Like, I know the Met released like these kind of like European masters, and that's why these are easy and publicly available and able to integrate into a service like Runway. But where are the other repositories? And she wrote back, you know, Latoya, that is a good question. I don't actually know. So I started digging. I asked my friends at NVIDIA, the ones who trained me. I asked around, and it turns out there just aren't that many. So you'll notice from about 2018, a very popular thing to do online was to go and to find your face in art. And for some people, this is a really fun, rewarding experience. Some of my friends got like almost exact matches that were eerie. And for some of us, we're like, results leave a little bit to be desired. D-Ray, who's very interesting, said, you know, I don't think I've seen any pieces of these work until Google matched me with them, right? And so this is an interesting tool for discovery of new art as well. But notice here down at the bottom from Rap Game in a Garden, which is an amazing Twitter handle. Is anyone else noticing how black people are mostly being matched with street art? Where are we? And I know for the other black curators I know, the people that I've worked with over the years, this has been an ongoing question. Where are the repositories? Where are our archives? And when you want to make something, you know, kind of like a digital arts project, or when you want to play around with these repositories, you kind of take for granted that something will be available and will be in the public domain in a way that's accessible. And what you start finding, particularly if you want to do black art or black collections, you kind of get the one or the other problem, right? So one, a lot of things that particularly contemporary black artists have is not in the public domain. You cannot use that for free. And the collections that might be in the public domain are not digitally available or not easily digitally available. So as you start scraping for things like, you know, at the Library of Congress, free to use the Gottlieb jazz photos, which is fantastic, right? But that's a source bank of about 25 images. For a style GAN, that's fine, right? You can do a one-to-one, it's not a big deal. But for any of the bigger AI projects, the facial swaps, the voice recognition, all of those different things, you need a much bigger base of images. So this talk is kind of both a question, and an open one that I'm still trying to solve, but also a provocation, which is when we think about the politics of digitization, when we think about kind of the historical implications of different groups being excluded from collections and from the general repository, we end up with this weird situation where it looks like there aren't masters of art that look like me, and there aren't masters of art that are people of color. We know that's not to be the case, so how can digitization help rectify that fact? That's it. Thank you.
So give us a quick second to get set up. A big thanks to you all for your presentations. I have lots of questions and so many ways that we can move forward with a great discussion. So we're going to run out of time, I know it. But this has been fascinating for me. I know a little bit about digitization, what's going on in my own museum, and perhaps I'm on this panel because I'm a curator of music and performing arts. When I think of the possibilities as a curator, I'm quite interested in content and the experience, particularly working with music and performing arts. Doing an exhibit is a far cry from what the actual event is. So I've always been interested in the experiential and how people live and engage with music. So this is quite interesting for me. So there's several ways I'd like to go, but you've all kind of pointed to some of the possibilities, but I'd like to ask, if you can give us some more examples of the new types of engagement that digital culture offers us, particularly those of us who work in museums. And anyone can start.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I think one of the most exciting things about emerging technology is that it starts to give you all of these additional ways to tell a story that you couldn't do. So like we all know, if you come from film background like I do, you have the director's cut, which is maybe I shot 90 hours of this documentary, but I can only fit in 2, right? And everything else is on the cutting room floor, and maybe it'll eventually surface at some point. But with the newer technologies, right, we have to, one, plan the experience totally different, in a very different way. So like with VR, a lot of it runs on sound, and particularly natural sound for those of us who are in VR journalism. And like that, just knowing that the sound archive is the first thing that we need to look for when we're in a story is a very different way of framing a story than the way we might have done it before. You know, building these worlds, building these types of immersive experiences do allow audiences to engage in a much deeper way. We can append things in real time, right? It's almost like having footnotes, but they can appear in front of your face suddenly. And then, of course, what's a more interesting way to present a footnote besides text, right? Is there an aside? Is there a thing you can do? So it opens up a lot of possibilities from the storyteller's perspective, and then it gives audiences ways to feel as though they're not just passively receiving the information, right? They can explore, they can feel it, they can touch it, they can feel like they're there, which is a different kind of experience overall. It can be very, very powerful, sometimes overly intimidating. So like Noni de la Peña's Work the Line, which takes people inside an abortion clinic protest. And then she had another one about domestic violence when I think 1/3 of people didn't actually complete the experience because it was too intense. When they realized how the domestic violence scenario was going to play out, they bailed, they pulled off the headsets. And so there's a lot more to think about too when we're presenting these immersive experiences than I think we got to in kind of the first and second generations of media.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the interesting things about, again, specific to VR and AR is that you are not limited like a film to telling a linear story. You have an entire, you know, when you watch a movie, again, you're just watching what somebody is presenting, so you don't get a chance to stop and smell the roses, literally. When you are in any kind of, or augmented reality where there's an overlay, you have a different experience, and so the information that is being shared to you can be curated differently because you might say, you know, I'm going to go experience this and it's going to stick. Something that would stick with me, something else might stick with you. And I think that opens a world of possibilities, literally. And I'll give you an example of one thing that wasn't entertainment related, but KLM, the airline, is a company that we're working with, and I got to go and use one of their training programs, which has to do with preparing flight attendants to deal with a fire on board a plane, which is something that nobody ever really wants to do. And in VR, I mean, they had the whole cabin mapped out. It was obviously first class cabin because it was at the front of the plane. I had to go find the fire extinguishers, and I would see the smoke. Now, there was no scent of smoke in the room, but I could smell it because I could see the fire. I could see it starting to come out of the various parts of the plane, and then the passengers started looking around, and some of them started freaking out, and one of them became aggressive and started walking toward me, and then the plane got fuller, more smoke, and then the baby starts crying, and suddenly, like, I'm like having a physical reaction to the stress of the moment, and that's a story. You know, that's a different way to say, here's the story, how are you going to take this information, and that's a new way of presenting it.
When I think about engagement and the ways that engagement is expressed, one of the things we really want to create in our audiences is that moment of discovery where they discover something new. And interactivity is a great way to make someone feel like they made the discovery and that it wasn't a discovery or it's not something they're being told or is being dictated to them. And this is something that we spoke about a little bit in our kind of pre-huddle here, was that there's a range of experience because we, often we have a point that we want to make, we have something we want to express. And that would be kind of more like a guided experience. So on one hand, we've got film that is a highly guided experience. They're taking your view and they're controlling where it is in the room, and you only see what they want you to see. They cut everything out. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've got fully interactive open worlds where you can go anywhere you want, you can do anything you want. And there's a bunch of places in between where we're kind of mixing the guided with the interactive. And it's the interactive component that gives us the ability to make someone have, or to give someone the opportunity to have a moment of discovery where they feel like they drove it and they were the ones discovering it. And that's what I like to pursue in my pieces, is to give people that aha moment and that understanding that they participated in versus just being told something.
So I'm going to stay on the story angle for a moment, and I'm glad we've kind of moved in that direction. You know, coming from a curator's perspective and working with exhibits, when you think about with digital, what it offers, what would you tell me if I came to any one of you, what is required to tell an engaging, non-linear story? How do I have to kind of rethink? I may have an idea that I think would be wonderful, but you all have experience in working in this, and how do you help people decide what is the best story to tell? I'll use an example. My exhibit that I've done at the museum is about African American music. And that's a pretty large story, but one of my goals is to get people to understand it from a variety of perspectives, not merely as entertainment, but as culture, as religion, and these the history of racism, how that really plays out. And so I'm very interested in the content as well as the experience, but I don't have the expertise to make that vivid and talk about, have the kind of sense of experience that you're talking about with visitors. So how would you talk me through that?
Did you have some ideas?
I'm gonna stop starting next time. I'm gonna make you start. Yeah, I think in 2012, I started going to this conference called the Game Developers Conference. It's the biggest industry event for people who make games. And a lot of the videos are actually up for free on YouTube in the GDC Vault. And people talked a lot about experiential play, particularly in the experimental games workshop, the first year that I went, and blending physical and digital experiences, and the way you have to think about mapping out space when you're blending in elements from each piece. And I've always thought, like, even now as I'm, moving into a career as a games creator, which I've never done before, and writing a script for a video game, which is very different than writing a news script or a screenplay script or any of those other things, you really have to center the person and the thing you think they're going to feel, the thing that they're looking for, the thing that they're trying to get, their motivations, as you mentioned earlier. All those things are more to the front than the story that you're trying to tell, which is really strange for a storyteller, right? You have to kind of put yourself in the backseat when you're used to being the sole kind of like third-party omniscient, I control everything. And in this one, it's closer to kind of like designing for theme parks or designing interactive, where you're going, okay, this is the sketch that this person's gonna bring themselves to. How do I guide them through it? And then how does my narrative wrap around their experience? It's a really different way of thinking.
Do you want to go next? Sure. just to break it up.
I think that it's helpful when you take a collection of stories that you'd like to tell, and you try to find a natural way for someone to explore and stumble across those. So in some of the pieces I've been creating lately, for instance, in the Chinese cave with the paintings, there's a number of different stories to tell, and they're all told based on the location. So as you naturally approach some painting because it's interesting to you, you find it visually interesting, when you get to that painting, that's when you start, the narrative starts to unfold of the story behind that painting that's giving you all of the context. So you can kind of take your stories and break them up into many different stories and then find another way to explore those stories and to stumble across them and connect them to one another. So that's kind of the approach that I would take, is to find the number of stories that you want to tell and find different ways to connect and explore them.
And just a little bit off that, and you brought up the subject of music, right? So, and thinking about the things, the little sub-stories, I suppose, that people can really connect with, like the violin has the instrument that sounds the closest to the human voice. Now, that's not going to be your main story, but that's interesting. And you can connect to that. I mean, I can because I'm a violinist, right? So that's interesting to me. That doesn't mean that everybody wants to hear that story, but think about those little sub-stories within that either engage you or engage other creative ideas, your thoughts, and then weaving around that. And people can still be drawn to the things that individual people, they would be drawn to individually, but you have a roadmap that is not linear, but it still is a guide of sorts.
So I'm going to ask another question because that's what I'm here to do. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, this is the entertainment panel, but a lot of our museums have an educational focus. What is that tension between education versus entertainment? And how do you shape that? I mean, a lot of people use virtual reality to entertain themselves, have fun, and we've talked about that. Is there a tension, and do you really think about that in the projects that you've worked on, particularly, and I talked about music, but someone pointed to the intensity of certain situations in our museum. I'm just using as a point of reference. There's strong historical situations that you could use virtual reality, augmented reality to really go through deep. And what do our visitors want? What should we give them? That kind of thing. And if you could talk about, even Greg, some of your experiences with some of your previous projects.
Sure. My experience so far, one conclusion I've come to through some things that I worked very hard on and tried to be very clear about conveying a great deal of information, is that if you overwhelm someone with words, there's no room left to feel and to experience and discover. So one hazard, one pitfall that you can run into along the way is trying to cram so much into the experience that they don't have the opportunity to discover things themselves or to feel. So I try to, when I make pieces now, I try to provide lots of breathing room, giving people time to absorb their environment and their surroundings, if it's about music, to actually listen to the music without the audio voiceover description as well. Now you need the context of these descriptions to appreciate what you're seeing a lot of the time. So it's a necessary component, but I think that it's a really important aspect to allow yourself room to feel and to be entertained. And when you are feeling and you're being entertained, you're going to be more receptive to the messages that are coming through. You're going to be able to absorb them better and provide your own context to those messages.
Well, in terms of tension between entertainment and education, I don't think that they can't go hand in hand, honestly, because, I mean, just if you think of the concept of, it's kind of a silly thing to say maybe, but if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life kind of idea. And I think the same interaction can be with education and entertainment. Entertainment, you're still going to leave with some sort of knowledge base, whether that's, fake knowledge, I suppose. Maybe I shouldn't use that word, or I should describe it another way. Maybe there really isn't, an alien planet and there really aren't, face huggers, but you did leave with that information, right? And so you have that story in your mind, and I think that, as you want to educate somebody about something, you can certainly do that in a way that might even be passive sometimes. And I don't know if that's a direct answer to your question, but it's a thought.
Let me see. I think for me, I have all of these memories of growing up and playing things like Oregon Trail and SimCity in class. And so to me, there's no, I don't see a tension. The tension that I tend to see between educational and entertainment programming is when one thing is trying to force to be the other, and it's not thoughtfully applied, right? In the same way that forcing a format is also kind of a big problem in interactive entertainment. Everything's not made to be an interactive story, just point blank. There's ways to tell almost any story and make it interactive, but you can't take something that you originally envisioned as kind of like a 2D thing and then try to all of a sudden just port it. It doesn't work in the same way. You have to think about it very differently. In terms of looking at what you deliver, right? I think people are looking to museums because they're curious, right? That's why I always go. I want to know something more about this thing. And these different types of experiences allow you to immerse more deeply in something that you already know you have interest with, right? Like, it doesn't matter if I'm going to go see that like beautiful cosmos thing at the Air and Space Museum with like all the planets. Like, I feel like I'm in a planetarium. That's awesome. I think that with the intensity and with subject matter, that's where it becomes really, really difficult, particularly for things that are kind of ugly in our historical past or shared past, because the level of intensity when you're inside of an immersive experience is much harder to manage and is much harder to do. You have to really spend a lot of time with like mood and tone. And in gaming, we have a thing called play testing. I think in experience design, it's probably something very similar where you are running this through with different users. You're not just dropping this on the public. Like, you're trying to get feedback to see where people are reacting. And even in the example I brought up earlier from Nani, her piece, the violence doesn't actually take place, right? So I should be really clear about that in that VR experience. What you are hearing is the real audio of a 911 call that was happening and playing out. And so at the point in which you hear the fatality, which is she leaves the house, she needs an editorial decision to leave the interior of the house and to move into the officer's perspective. So now you're out on the ground with the officers and you're coming here and you hear a gunshot. But so all the while, there's no violence on screen, there's no bloodshed, there's nothing of that. She also did a piece on Trayvon Martin, she did a piece at Guantanamo Bay. And she spent a lot of time trying to think about when you're creating news content based on real events, because also we have a lot of ethics in the news field around how you recreate certain types of activities. And so there's a lot of controversy, particularly around a lot of Nani's early work, around whether this was recreating something in a way that was like ethical, but also served the public good more than like entertainment value. But it's a really, really hard thing, particularly around history. So there's I'm looking into military and video game technology as another kind of side project. And there was this game called 6 Days in Fallujah that was scrapped in 2009. And what's interesting about that game is it was supposed to be about what happened, kind of like the bloodiest battle in Iraq. And people at the time were like, oh, video games can't handle this type of subject matter. It's too serious. But that's really interesting to me because the creators of that game are also the creators of America's Army, the game used to recruit by the US military. The reason those guys wanted to make that game was because half their friends that they interviewed for the game didn't come back. And so when we're talking about interactive, there's so much that's unsaid yet, there's so much undone, there's so much that doesn't have precedent because it's new. And we're kind of still really roughly feeling our way through it. So the idea is, I think, to find the core of like what your value is as a museum and to try to deliver on that, but to always make sure that kind of like the technology and the lust of like the story doesn't let you get into territory that becomes really difficult for the people that you're trying to serve.
Okay, I have one last question before we go to Q&A. I'll cross out the other ones. Let's talk about, I think we're all very excited about the possibilities, but be a little more pragmatic and logistics. What are the technical requirements for effective storytelling within an immersive technology? I mean, what do we need to think about, whether it's space, headsets? I'm gonna let Amy start off with that.
So in terms of, I look at it as always having a premium experience, right? So your end consumer or client or audience needs to be fully engaged. So the technical part of it that's most important, there are a few of them. One is you need to make sure that you have a quality graphics and you've curated, you've done the story part ahead of time, but you can't fail now on your execution. So in terms of when you're approaching something, you understand what the budget is going to be, and you are willing to put the money in to make sure that it's done right. Now that's very simplistic and probably not quite what you were aiming for in your question, but I think that can be forgotten a lot of times. You know, having, if you're not just, let's say, virtual reality, you touched on this a little bit, where there's a mix of the real world and the virtual world. Think about if what you're doing is important to have haptics of some kind. So whether the haptics be actual, like glove haptics, finger haptics, or you have other props that somebody is perhaps going through, you know, we'll say someplace in Alaska, and they need to climb a mountain, and, you know, is that part of the education experience that they need to have? Do they need to fill the tree? You know, so that's not, it's just, again, that's just coming down to the actual execution of it. And of course, well, for my company, the hygiene and then the actual comfort of the experience. Are you making sure that you're not, you know, getting the sweat from the person before you, or, you know, the makeup from one person to the next? So thinking about the entirety of the process, I think, is important when it comes down to it. Now, you would probably speak to the technical components of the content itself a little better than I would, so I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. I mean, actually, I have comments as well about just creating an experience for a public experience. There are a lot of considerations. You know, obviously, the cleanliness and health and safety of your viewers would be pretty high. But there's also things like queuing, having long lines. You know, when you've got a small number of headsets and you've got a 20-minute experience, you know, you can have a very small throughput, and it can be a bad audience experience if they're waiting in line with nothing to entertain them. And there's lots of ways that dealing with this. You know, some of the best examples I've seen is where you go, you sign up, you give them your cell number, you get a text 2 minutes before your session is supposed to occur, and then you can enjoy the museum for the rest of the time. We also discussed some of the uses that have been used in other museums, and Carnegie Arena, for instance. It's a piece about immigration, and they express the immigration experience by where you wait before you go in. They built a replica of what was called the refrigerator, which was a holding tank that they would put all the immigrants in once ICE captured them. So you'd sit in there without any shoes. It was kept at a very low temperature, and you saw all the shoes of all the people who had passed through before you. And so that was kind of preparing you for the VR experience. And there's many other ways that you can kind of create a preparing experience, and also coming out of the VR experience that kind of makes it a long continuum where the VR is a piece of it. So in Carnegie Arena, for instance, when you leave, you saw these virtual characters that were represented, and maybe you didn't know when you watched it, but those are all based on real people. And when you exit, you see videos, interviews of those people, and you actually get to see and learn about their real life. And that made the overall experience much more meaningful.
Cool. I mean, Carnegie Arena was such a fantastic piece. I just cannot express enough. I didn't even get to see it. I just got to watch the deconstruction of it, and I was like, it's amazing. Yeah, I think the biggest thing, too, we were talking a little bit earlier before the panel, and one of the most interesting things I've seen is how New Frontiers at Sundance does this from year to year. And normally there is nothing for somebody who's waiting to get an experience. And these are people, like, you know, we've paid $200 for this ticket, and you have to kind of basically run to the exhibit you want, hope you make it, wait in line 40 minutes, kill time until it's your turn. Like, it's a really inefficient use of time. But there was one year that was different, and it was because they had invited Kendrick Lamar and his crew to come in the wake of To Pimp a Butterfly. And his crew basically set up the most simple exhibit that was there. Everything else was all VR and, like, you know, 20-minute wait times, these grandiose experience inside a headset. And they set up 2 benches and 2 screens in the album. And that was it. They came in every morning, hit play, and then left. And everybody else was jealous. But what was wonderful was that, so it's playing the album, and there's 2 different video tracks around Compton that they just kind of curated and scored that would loop with the album over and over and over again. And so while we were all waiting for these other experiences, we were always dropping into Kendrick's experience. passively. Like, you didn't have to do anything. You could sit there and absorb 20 minutes of this and then come back and go to your exhibit, come back, wait for the next one, 20 more minutes of Kendrick. And because it was always changing, right? Like, you could watch one loop that's going with one part of the album, then come back and see something completely different the second time. It was a super compelling experience. So I think the thing for me is always to not undercount your user's own imagination in what they would like to experience. I think we get really into the technical weeds a lot of times, and we're like, oh, this is gonna be $8 million, and we need 70,000 headsets, and we need this, we need that. But sometimes pull it back. Like, what is the essence of the experience, the mood, the thing, and then build up from there.
Actually, I think this is something that museums do really well. I mean, you already have all this space and you take a person through the story by walking through the space. So I think thinking in terms of, let's just say, virtual or augmented reality as a part of that exhibit as opposed to a destination in that exhibit, I think that's important. Sorry, I know you were supposed to have the last word, but I couldn't help myself.
We can take one or two questions for our panelists, if there are any. We have a microphone roving around.
Yes, I think it's on. I'm an interactive application developer for NMAAHC, and one of the things when I am creating that application, and this is for Latoya and Greg, is you guys have all said it, and it's from the last panel as well. The interactive is meant to give it this experience, and a really good interactive causes you to like that. In our museum, we have like these booths where people can tell their story. That is a great opportunity to capture people's, to emote, and to be able to add to that experience, and then capture a person's reaction to that experience. So I want to know what your thoughts are, and specifically, Greg, that one where you have that window, how would you go ahead technically to actually capture it so it's actually part of the experience? Does that make sense? Not really, right?
How would I capture the window or the environment?
Right. How would you capture a visitor, their experience? We're talking about pushing all of these experiences, but capture the visitor's experience and save it.
Right. So you want to record the visitor in the VR experience.
And take whatever they want to share for
Sure.
part of their story.
Yeah. Well, that's once you create a full 3D world, it's relatively simple to then record the positions of their headsets, what they're saying through the microphone, the positions of their hands, what they're picking up. That's all pretty simply recorded within, there are simple plugins within Unity, which is the platform that I use, that can allow you to record head pose, hand poses, audio, all of this data synchronized. So you can record all of that off and have that play back any way you like. Now, you won't get the more detailed movements of how someone is standing with their feet, the rest of their physical body, what they're doing, because there are no sensors on it. But conceivably, you could also do that with maybe a depth camera or like a Kinect or some other sensor if you wanted to create new material from that. Yeah, have it feed back into the experience. Yeah, so that's an interesting area to explore. I can only think of one example, which is there's a piece called Where Do Thoughts Go?, which is a really beautiful virtual reality piece where as you go through it, you encounter, I believe it was bubbles, and you select these bubbles, and when you select them, it's expressions of the previous user's thoughts. So you're kind of being asked questions about things that are emotional and meaningful, and then you're asked to then express your own thoughts and feelings on this. And it's recorded, and then it's played back when the next person comes through. They get your thought bubbles, and they encounter your thought bubbles. So if they pick the bubble that contains your thought, it's played back for them. So that's one example I can think of where someone has done that. And it worked out really beautifully, so I'd encourage you to explore that area.
think we can take one more.
Oh, yeah, quickly on that. One, Hank Willis Thomas's Question Bridge, and looking at the evolution of that project over 5 years has been really interesting in terms of like people seeing a work, responding to a work, and then that becoming part of the work. But there was also an installation I saw from a friend of mine who's like, she works in sound ethnography. And so she was doing this project on like walking in the streets of Taiwan and doing it in like sneakers versus high heels, with high heels announcing her presence as a woman. But one of the projects that she showed and how like the streetscapes changes based on that sonic cue. But one of the projects she showed me was about whispers. And I always thought that was so provocative because like the landscape that you're looking around always stays the same. I think it was just like screens of just like a moor or something, some kind of just big field. But then you put on this headset and then there's people whispering different like secret stories and you're trying to get a sense of the narrative in there. And I can think particularly like when you start in the basement level of the museum, right? Whispers and sound sometimes are just like a quiet retelling of a story while you're looking at other artifacts is one way to do it. It's not always like, I think everything doesn't have to always be the full digitalization of it. Sometimes it's allowing like just this one thread piece come through. I know you want to get to another question.
Thank you. So let's talk about distribution for a bit. You all talked about location-based entertainment and public events, but how about taking the museum into your home? Like you were talking, Latoya, about how some of these events might cost $200 or waiting in line for 2 hours. Commercial headsets that you can purchase are $200 a piece, right? Why not pay that as a ticket and then have access to the expansive worlds from your own home without the waiting time? And what is being done in that sense, and where are we with that?
Yeah, I mean, excellent question, and really, really good, because yes, democratization of information and experiences is so important. That's why I love museums and libraries. But one of the things that's interesting about the distribution problem, and I'd love to hear the other panelists' perspective, because this is just mine coming from entertainment, is that distribution is the thing we have not hacked on AR and reality. It's like, if I want to go see Black Panther, but I had to know who published it, which 6 theaters might play it, is it available, do I have the patch, where is Steam, what is this even, is it only in the Oculus store? It is a nightmare right now. And so we have these advances, like, we have the Quest now, which is completely tetherless. You don't have to have a computer, you don't have to pay $1,500 for something that can run this thing. You're not doing endless software patches. Like, do you remember like the old Samsung headsets? Where like one app, you have 10 apps on that thing, and then one is out of date, so then this damn thing doesn't work, and then you have to redo all the apps and figure out which one is wrong. Like, there's so many nightmares with like the personal part. I think that's the goal and the dream that we all want to get to. But I think that from a distribution standpoint, we're not there yet, and from kind of like a common kind of baseline software, we're not there yet. It's really, really tough.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the reasons that location-based entertainment is useful right now is because some of those barriers you mentioned. I mean, the price point is still going to be a barrier for a while. The content availability, the cost of creating content is going to need to come down a little bit more. The goal, I would hope, would be to do something, I know that there's some experimentation with VR and AR across various, museums in the Smithsonian. It would be great if there was something, at the Smithsonian that, you share all your stories here and you create your, your own content, your own database, and I'm sure you are doing some of that on some level. So I think I agree the distribution platforms still need to evolve much more than they are, but I think part of that process will, as people comment and are thrilled with the content that you just created, and oh my God, this experience was so amazing, or I never knew this about this object, or this about history, that also pushes the needle a little bit more in terms of what's forcing the industry, the people that are asking for it.
I would encourage you to distribute on as many platforms as you have time and budget to do. I've published a number of pieces on Steam, and I do that because it reaches all the headsets that you can move around inside of, so all the tethered headsets. There are some complications with going to specific formats. For instance, we were talking about the Quest. The Quest is an incredible game-changing device. It's probably going to have way more downloads than any other platform. However, that means that you also have to author it for Android, which means you may be authoring it for PC and for Android, which is going to increase your development costs. So there's quite a bit to that. The other thing to consider is if you're going to be distributing, you also want to start thinking about marketing for for what you're creating. If you think about like the Apple App Store, you know, they have, what, 3 million apps now? So now if you publish an app on the App Store, it's hard to ever get found. And the same thing is starting to happen with Steam. Is by just publishing on Steam, you can be found right now, but that's slowly changing into a world where you're going to disappear among thousands of other apps. But yeah, I'm all for doing that, and it doesn't mean that you can't also do location-based entertainment. There's also a number of platforms that are specifically for location-based entertainment. So they're distribution platforms that allow your work to then be shown in VR arcades or other museums where the licensing is set up specifically for location-based entertainment.
I want to thank our panelists for joining us this morning. Thank you for a fantastic conversation and a lot of food for thought. I'm sure there's much for everyone to talk about. I've been told it's lunchtime, so you have a break, and you're supposed to be back here at
11, sorry, not at 11, at 1:25, please. Also, if anybody has their backpacks or suitcases that they want stored, we can store it in a closet right across from the registration desk, but you must pick it up by the end of the day. Thank you.